welcome everybody to the second episode of Baroness Barker's Book Club. Baroness Barker's Book Club, I didn't choose the title. The purpose of it is to talk to really interesting people about issues and find from that a way into books, which we all love. And particularly, I suppose, what we're trying to do is draw to people's attention books that they might have missed, which we think will be interesting and relevant to what's going on now, even though they might have been written quite a long time ago. And today I'm really, really pleased to have with me a fellow member of the House of Lords. I'm going to break the conventions now. I'm going to call him my noble friend. I'm not supposed to because he's in a different group from me, but Lord Fowler, Norman Fowler. Well known to many of you as being a long-term serving member of the Conservative governments of the 1980s and 1990s. You'll remember not just every portfolio you had, but every date and comma. I don't, but transport. I mean, there are some people who still wax lyrical about your time as Transport Secretary. But for our purposes, health and social security, as it was at the time, was a massive
together,
massive bridge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. And today, what we're going to do is look at you. You had a background in journalism, didn't you, Norman?
I started in journalism. When I came down from university, I went onto the Times straight away. I don't know quite how I managed that. Mm. I had been doing a bit of vacation work, so that was really the entry in. But I was on the Times from 1961 to 1970 until I got into Parliament. So my background's entirely journalistic.
And that shows in your writing, because your writing is incredibly crisp and clear. And I think you can always tell when somebody's been a journalist. They that discipline never leaves them. Even if they didn't work on the Sun, they worked on the Times, and they got more word space. But certainly there. And for nothing else, I mean, there are so many political memoirs which are just so badly written. I mean, even if they've got an interesting story to tell, they are just such a torture. But yours are not. They are really crisp and really clear. So today we're going to focus on 3 of your books. The first one, if I might say so, is my favourite, is A Political Suicide, which you wrote in 2006, and is really your observations being a cabinet minister through Mrs. Thatcher's government, her demise, which has now been set on film so many times in fact and fiction, and John Major's government and the prolonged agonies of that. And also your more recent book, The Best of Enemies, which is really about Mrs. Thatcher and Ted Heath. And then we'll also talk a bit later on about your book about HIV/AIDS, about Don't Die of Prejudice. But I want to go back to those first 2. You clearly obeyed the first rule of politics, or first rule of a government minister. You kept a diary, didn't you?
I think I disobeyed the first rule. I think the first day in cabinet, first out in cabinet, I think Margaret Thatcher had said to everyone, "I don't want anyone keeping a diary." Well, I thought I didn't keep a diary for the first few months, obeying my master. But then I thought, this is rubbish, and I was confirmed by that when Margaret Thatcher's notes came out, when her memoirs came out, it was obvious that she was relying entirely upon people's recollections, etc. So I think it's rubbish. I think it depends what kind of diary you keep. If you keep a diary which simply says, you know, I don't know, Mr. Brown is having an affair with Mrs. somebody else, I think, well, you know, you can do that. You're probably very well paid. But it's not my kind of thing. And I just wanted to keep a diary which recorded what had happened over what I thought at that stage was going to be a very important period, as it proved to be.
Yeah, it did. And I think that what one of the most interesting aspects of going back to your book now after a gap of such a long time is that how different the external impressions of the individuals who made up Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet were. I mean, some of us still live with spitting image in our minds, and yet you portray almost like you almost portray a bit like a firm where you've got the different people in different departments in a firm, and which departments are being creative, which ones are jumping to the front of the queue. Is that how it felt?
I think it is. Well, I think it's how it should feel, because it is like a firm, and like a firm, people need to be together, which has been the theme of at least two of my books, because we failed miserably to keep together at times.
We're going to come to
but
that.
if you're a firm, then that's part of the deal, I think, and that's certainly how I felt about it. And I also felt that, although we may come to this, I had my reservations about Margaret Thatcher, and also got into serious opposition later on. I mean, she was a formidable leader, and even if she hadn't have been, I think that once you have accepted her job, or the job that has been offered to you by the leader of the party, then you are on a bound to support that leader until it gets too difficult for you. Then you can go, but unless that happens, you should be a loyal member.
You very, very firmly said of her, she liked nothing better than a thoroughgoing argument about policy, and she would take up positions that would provoke arguments, but that was a really good discipline to go through as a government minister.
Was. It wasn't her only characteristic. I mean, when she was in opposition, I had long discussions with her about what we should do in government, and it was mainly on transport, which wasn't the sexiest subject of all time at that stage. And we went into whether you could cost individual lines, individual railway lines and things of that sort. And I mean, she was quite fascinating. She was once transport minister herself, and
a scientist.
And a scientist.
Yeah.
And when I first took over, when I was first offered the job, I basically said to her, "Margaret, I know absolutely nothing about transport." And her reply was, "I did transport, you can do transport." And so I did. And it was the best job I ever had.
Now that's a tradition that continues, because one of my colleagues said that he just got a phone call from our leader to say, "I want you to be transport spokesperson," to which he said, "I don't know anything about transport." "Welcome to Westminster," was the answer. So apparently,
that's quite right.
It really is. But going on to you subsequently went back to write the Best of Enemies, the focus about Margaret Thatcher and Teddy. Why did you choose to do that after all that time?
Well, it was more about Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and why I did it was that I thought, apart from anything else, that John Major had been unfairly treated.
Yeah.
I mean, he had become leader because of Margaret Thatcher's support for him, and almost immediately she withdrew that support. And I thought that was almost an impossible thing to understand. She was obviously very much broken by the fact that she had been turfed out, and one understands that, but there were different ways of dealing with that position. I mean, almost every Prime Minister at some stage has got to that position, and you don't normally just turn on the person who has taken over, particularly when that person, John Major, had not actually had any part in any plots against her. I mean, it wasn't that he had plotted night and day to get the job. He hadn't. I think he was almost surprised to get the job at the end, but he did. So I thought he'd had an unfair deal, and I thought, by the same measure, I think at times she had had too kind a deal, and people would always say, well, Margaret Thatcher should be understood for this and that, but it postponed sort of all judgments at times of a great leader, disastrous ex-leader. I mean, that's how I would describe her.
I confess I have been to a Conservative Party conference. I went to the Conservative Party as a visitor, I hasten to understand, to the famous one in Bournemouth. And there I was, back at the hall, 5,000 people in Bournemouth, and there was Margaret Thatcher and Ted Heath on those IKEA chairs at the front. And I have to say, from a distance of a packed hall, you could still see the radiation of well, what would you describe? Enmity between the two. Do you think she did suffer quite a bit from her sort of glacial treatment by Ted Heath?
Yes, I think she did. I mean, and that, in a sense, I think that was part of her excuse for doing the same to John Major. But there's no question that Ted resented deeply being turfed out. But there used to be a tradition when ex-leaders who were turfed out, and goodness knows it's not exactly uncommon, just kept quiet for a bit and didn't complain. Ted was in the most enormous sulk ever. He was a very difficult man to get close to, Ted. I mean, I voted for him several times, but I can't claim that I ever knew him properly.
Don't think many people did. I think a very small, select band did.
I think that's
from
correct.
Things that I read and watched.
Yes,
Yeah.
and he had a band of faithful supporters, but it wasn't a mass following, frankly, in a personal sense.
And yet, I think John Major has been a model of dignity in his retirement.
Yes.
He really has.
Yes.
And I think that's probably caused people to go back and reflect on his time in office and put it in a better light than they did at the time.
Yes, I hope that's the case. I think it is the case. He was in office. He was far too sensitive about what the press was saying day by day. You knew perfectly well if you met John outside Westminster and there were newspapers there, he would go to the newspapers, read them, go to page 15, and there he would find a small paragraph by someone I'd never heard of, criticising John Major. And he had this feeling that he needed to read everything that had been written about him. And that was his major drawback, I think, as a leader. But as a man and as a leader as well, he was extremely good, extremely loyal, and altogether underestimated. And had Margaret supported him more, then I think his period of office would have been much happier and probably much more successful.
The unsaid theme that's running through all of this is the Conservative Party in Europe, isn't it?
Yes.
Sitting now as we do in the position that we are, do you think that the Brexit vote has now settled that for the Conservative Party, or is what that issue symbolises still sitting there in the heart of the Conservative Party
I think it's still sitting there a bit, no more than a bit, substantially. I don't know if it's ever going to lead to the kind of ructions that we had in the 80s and 90s and going on from there. But it was a great, it was obviously divided the party. It divided the party generally down the middle. I don't think there was much one could do about it. People just had very different views about what they wanted from Europe. There was a vast difference between Ken Clarke and Michael Heseltine and John Redwood and whoever. I mean, I was, if you like, in the middle a bit on this. I was a supporter of the European idea and of the European Union. I rather hoped, never happened, that Europe would take a world power position and that it would speak with one voice and it would have much more influence than it did. Well, it never did have that influence, frankly. We had a Europe which was, I mean, if people think back on Europe and the years of the European Union, you think far too often about restrictions and regulations, and regulation here which had come on something you'd never heard of, and the House of Commons stayed up all nights to get it through. It was such a shame that no one would set out the real value of Europe. But there were no loss of people, who were prepared to actually say their role on this. And a lot of the Conservative Party said that. So I think it was inevitable there was going to be a division. The division, in a sense, stays on. You've still got people who say, if we only, I don't know, turned to Johnson and had a really nice and good anti-European policy, we'd sweep the country. Well, I don't think we would, actually. But that is all going to have to be played out. The most interesting Brexit warrior was William Hague, and no one would think that, really. But he was absolutely determined. I was in his shadow cabinet, and he was quite determined on Brexit, and quite determined that he wasn't going to give way on this issue. And again, he was rather like John Major to this extent. He was underestimated. He was a brilliant speaker, the best speaker we ever had. Yeah. I mean, bar none.
Yeah. A brilliant performer in the Commons.
That's what I mean, really. Yeah, I mean, in the Commons, he was absolutely in a class of his own. And the trouble was, of course, he was a very young man, and he hadn't really got the experience at that stage, which I think you need, to actually handle all the personal issues and the political issues which came up, which could trip you up unless you were careful. And he didn't have that experience, basically, is what I'm saying.
The reason I asked you about that is because I chose to read A Political Suicide about 18 months or so ago, which was when the Conservative Party was in the throes of the agonies of the Rishi Sunak government. And at the end of the book, you chronicle what it's like to be inside the death throes of a government that's been around for a very, very long time. And you come to a conclusion that there are 9 things that the Conservative Party must not do. With the one exception, which was about sorting itself out on Europe, which is why I asked you about that. When I read, they were resolutely ignoring the other 8, which are all sensible things like a divided party never goes down well. Don't be dependent on big donors. It's all there, perfectly clear. Yeah. And at the point I was reading it, I was just doing a checklist of well,
there was a Labour MP who said that everyone in the Labour Party should read this book because it was.
I think everybody should, and not just Labour. Yes, I really do. Yes. I really, really do think, and that's one reason to commend it. And the follow up in the other book as well, I think was a great addition to that too. Not least because reading it, and again reading at a distance of sometimes the minor characters like John Biffin, for example,
yes,
and their importance was not something that outsiders truly, yes, I think, understood at the time. And for anybody who really wants to be a student of our government, our working, successful government, and also you're really good about being quite clear that people shouldn't become enthralled to external advisors.
Yeah.
There was quite a lot of that going on, wasn't there?
There was quite a lot, and still is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of my hobby horses, really. We've got too many special advisors. They spend a lot of the time fighting each other as well. fighting each other for their master or mistress, and so you inject, if you like, a bit of disunity into the whole body right from the beginning. Now it was special advisors, too many. When I was doing, you mentioned when I was doing health, I did health and social security together, the two pretty big departments, and I had one special advisor, and only one, Nick True, who happens now to be the leader of the House of Lords, and he was very good, and I didn't really feel that I needed any more. And Margaret Thatcher, to her credit, was very restrictive about special advisors and how many people could become special advisors. I think she was right about that. I mean, I think that ministers, I mean, I was lucky in as much as I was in opposition for a bit before I kind of went in to the government. And if you can have a period of that kind, then you can think it all out beforehand. The trouble with what's been happening since then is that ministers have moved from slot to slot without actually ever getting their feet properly under the table.
I came into the House of Lords a long time ago, and one of the many discombobulating things about it was that something that everybody always says is that the House of Lords is actually a very kind and very helpful place. I think Peter Hennessy once said that in the House of Lords, the weapon of choice is politeness, really. But like everybody who comes into this amazing building, I used to get lost. And these members of the 1983 cabinet would say, well, can I help you? And I'd stand there thinking, I used to go on demonstrations against you. I'm really not sure about this at all. The first time you and I got to meet was an occasion when I got to sit down and ask you the question that I'd always wanted to ask you. And I'm going to ask you again today. There you were, Health Minister, 1985. Along comes this disease, which is attacking, frightening. Nobody has any idea what's really much about how it's being transmitted, but it does seem to be disproportionately hitting populations like gay men. And you're the health minister, and you have got to go and see Mrs. Thatcher, who at that point was, along with Ronald Reagan, probably one of the most right-wing people in the world. Not so much now. How on earth did you do it? How did you get her to...
Well, I didn't persuade her, that's for one.
Okay.
Basically, I went round her, and that's always quite a good idea with Margaret. If you were in disagreement. We were in profound disagreement on this. It was if you like, the parting of the waves as far as I was concerned. I'd been with her for, I don't know, best part of 10 years, I guess, by that stage. But on this one, we were profoundly disagreed. She didn't share my views on HIV/AIDS, didn't share my views on how we should be talking about and treating gay people, certainly didn't share my views on the advertising that we did. I mean, I remember on the advertising, she, at one stage, on one set of advertisements, or it was a leaflet, I think, in the end, she made a complaint to the obscene publications.
I think we've got a question about that. Yeah, exactly. That one of our listeners, yes.
That she was complaining about me, without actually telling me either. This was a proposal that had gone through, by this stage we had a special AIDS committee, and it had gone through the AIDS committee. We've got half the cabinet on it. But without telling me or anybody else, she just quietly complained, first of all to the obscene publications people, then I think to one of the media committees as well. And they both said, no, it's a very serious issue, and it should be dealt with in a serious way, and that was that. She had the last word, I have to say, on that, because I was trying to get a ministerial broadcast on AIDS. And the one thing you never know about ministerial broadcasts, unless you try and do one, is that the final decision rests with the Prime Minister.
Right.
So the Prime Minister can veto it, and that's precisely what she did. She vetoed by I don't think it mattered too much, because we were having by this stage quite a lot of publicity of one kind or another. But it was a pity that I think she was so way out on this subject, so and reasonably unsympathetic as well, which was not like her. She was normally fairly sympathetic, even on issues which she didn't agree with.
When we talked about this before, you said that one of your great allies was the then Deputy Prime Minister. It was Willie Whitelaw.
Willie was an old soldier, really. I mean, first of all, he said, his belief was that, we had a committee, he was the chairman of that committee, and as long as he and I agreed, then he stayed solidly to it. But he also had an old soldier's view. I mean, he didn't regard AIDS as being something of the devil, and the rest. I mean, in his day, there'd been the issue of VD, venereal disease.
Didn't you say he was in the military police in Cairo?
No, I don't think he was in the military police. I think he was in the Middle East somewhere at one stage. And so he had a fairly mature view on
this is a public health issue. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And he dealt with it as a public health issue, which is in many ways what I was dealing with as well. He never ever gave an interview on it. So although he was chairman of the committee, he said, "You are going to give all the interviews." So I did. But he always supported me, every way.
One of the other things that I know, as long-standing member of the All Parliamentary Group on HIV/AIDS, we both are. You did something deliberately at that time. You went to the opposition spokespeople, and you deliberately said to them, come into the department, come to the briefing. Whatever we know about this, you shared it with them. And people like Archie Kirkwood and I believe Harriet Harman, that there is a debate back about 1986, which I must go back and read. They said that neither of them could remember a time when another minister had been so open with them as opposition spokespeople.
Well, it was an archetypal non-party political issue.
Correct.
And I wanted everyone to be batting more or less on the same side, and they did. And there was no question about that. I mean, whether I was as open as I could have been, I don't know. But I tell you, it's nice of you to say that I was more open than most. That's perfectly true. But if ever there was a reason for parties getting together, ministers getting together, it was on HIV and AIDS. And I don't think I ever got let down by anyone on this in terms of the leadership. We had people, mainly in the Conservative Party, I think, who hated the whole idea, who weren't prepared to accept it, and just took pot shots from time to time. But that was mirrored what was happening in the public generally. There were people there who were completely opposed, not only to what I was doing, but opposed to talking about these things, talking about HIV/AIDS, talking about gay people and the rest. But in the main, the political leaders all played a fairly honourable part.
One of the questions we had from Catherine Meads, I think, was exactly about the incident you said with Margaret Thatcher. There was some leaflet produced which people decided was pornographic, and it was withdrawn, and yet it it was very effective with the group of people to whom you were trying to get health messages.
I saw that. I don't recognise it actually as a because mine was a slightly different experience of that, but I didn't fully recognise that as being a description of what had. I'm sure they're right. I mean, it may well have been that officials who were initially rather more nervous than the ministers, interestingly enough, may have said, well, it's a bit too racy for us. I don't know. But we fairly quickly, as a government, moved out of that, actually. Not entirely.
And given your experience back then, what would you now look at? You know, we've come through a pandemic. We've mpox, and we know that sooner or later another zoonosis will appear over the horizon. And what would be the lessons that you draw from your time for now and for the future?
Well, I think you need to be as open as possible. It goes back to that. I think you need to be as open as possible about the risk, and you may get it wrong, but it's much better to be open about the risk. And as you know, we see it recently with the Archbishop. I mean, it's better to say, you know, this is wrong or whatever it happens to be, as openly as you can, and not to try and cover it up in any way. Don't mean maliciously, but just to cover it up and move on to something else. I think that now the issue has changed a bit. I mean, I think the issue now is we've got to remember, in the 1980s, we had no medicine, no means of treating HIV/AIDS. And so it was a different ball game, and the only weapon one had was the weapon of publicity, and that was why we used it. Now it's different to that. We've got to persuade people sometimes to take the opportunity that the new medicines provide, to take it up. And I think it points to one of the big issues of today, and that is stigma about HIV/AIDS, which is represented in many ways. But some governments, obviously overseas, I don't think in this country, but some governments, I mean, just can't take AIDS as a subject, and they do nothing about it. Russia does next to nothing about it.
Yes.
But there are several others. I mean, Uganda comes to mind. Sad Uganda, it started very well and ended disastrously. And in a way, the big issue now, I think, is for us in this country, because the numbers we have suffering from AIDS, being treated for AIDS, is low in comparison to many of the other countries of the world. But if we can establish that what we're doing actually works and actually leads to a permanent reduction and leads to people living a better and more acceptable life, then I think we would have done some good. And I rather hope, and have always hoped, that we could actually set a standard that other countries could look at. Some of them were obvious countries who wouldn't touch it with a barge pole, but they're beyond prejudice at the moment. I mean, they just there's no way at the moment of persuading them. But there are others who aren't in that position, and you can persuade. So it's going to be a long battle, I fear. People talk about the end of AIDS. Well, up to a point, but it's the end of AIDS. It might well be the end of AIDS in Europe. Thank goodness for that. But it's not going to be the end of AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not going to be the end of AIDS in Eastern Europe.
No, but you and I have had the privilege of listening to very many researchers and health professionals from around the world, and they're quite clear with us. If we can't solve HIV in Africa, we can't solve it anywhere at all. We really have got to not however well we may or may not be doing in the West, we can't give up on that.
But we can actually take the lessons from the West, because remember, I mean, we started in a sense in exactly the same position. I mean, you know, it was homosexuality was a criminal offence and all that. So we've gone through all that. So we should be able to communicate with a certain amount of humility the lessons that we draw from it. Then it's up to other countries.
I wanted to ask you a question that it's been running through my mind this last few weeks. I always remember when I was at university in the module that I did on international relations, I always remember our lecturer saying that in the United States, the Democrats could never make any headway in the then Cold War because they'd always got the Republicans on their back. You needed a Republican president of the like of Ronald Reagan to make progress on that. And I've often wondered whether in this country it takes a Labour government to make progress on reform of the NHS, because they haven't got, because if a Conservative sets out to do it, they've always got the press and the left on their back. Do you think that's right?
There is something in that. There certainly is something in that, but it's not entirely the way you argue it. It's also that the Conservative Party don't take their opportunities, and sometimes they bend to the kind of arguments that are being put. Like, I mean, let's not worry about the National Health Service. Let's think about all the opportunities there are in the private sector. Well, I'm entirely in favour of the public sector and the private sector cooperating with each other, but it's not a case of either or. It's a case of both. And yes, it happens. Private sector is a small part of healthcare in this country. It may grow, and it has grown over the years, but I think at times we've argued it so that we give the impression that the only thing we're interested in is private healthcare. Well, that isn't the case, and the Conservative Party would be well advised to get off that particular hook.
You are now 85?
Nice of you to say so.
You are 85.
86.
86.
You're almost 87.
Yeah, you went on to have another career as Speaker in the House, Speaker in the Lords, which you did with great aplomb and clearly enjoyed thoroughly, didn't you?
I did, yes, you're quite right.
You did. You really did enjoy it. And you've now retired from that. Is there another book in the offering? Is there?
I am not sure about that. I've got so many notes and so many. There might be one or two.
And
depends how long I last, frankly.
And what is your? I mean, having gone through the madness of Liz Truss and all the rest of it, you're sitting there with your 9 golden lessons. What would your word of advice be to an incoming government that wants to make health, the health service, the best it could be? Because that's really, I think, probably the achievement that you will forever be linked with.
I think that it's a very good question. I mean, I think the current government have done it quite well. I think the Health Secretary is doing it quite well. The trouble with, if I can say this, trouble with the Labour Party is that they tend to make the health service a political issue, and that a party political issue, I mean, and that I think is a mistake on their part and doesn't do anyone any particular good. So if we can get out of this habit of just banging on about to each other in a party political way on the health service, that would help. There's probably far too much to hope for, but that, I think, if we could make that jump, then that would be to everyone's advantage.
Okay. 2 final questions. Yes, Minister. How much of a grain of truth was there in Yes, Minister, do you think?
There was some grain of truth in it. Yes, there's obviously some grain of truth in it, more than a grain perhaps. I mean, the authors had gone round collecting as much stuff as they could from people who'd served. So civil servants loved it, or some of them did, generally, the ones I knew did, because they had the opportunity of telling people in an anonymous way what had happened to them. But I think it's a mistake to think that the civil service run government, or even have the ambition to run government. I don't think they do. I think they have the ambition to be good civil servants and to enable the elected government to put into place their policies. I remember at one stage when I left one of the government departments, a civil servant came up to me, and it was the last one I did, employment, and talked about the dock labour scheme, which, I mean, Mrs. Thatcher and her had been hovering about for decades. Telling I abolished the thing, and he said, "This made my civil service career entirely justified." It was now you wouldn't expect that from a civil servant. I just no idea that he felt. He was quite senior. No idea that he felt quite as strongly about it as he did, but he did. And it's always a mistake, I think, of particularly the press, perhaps, to feel that the civil service take a particular view. I don't think they necessarily do. I think they just want, in the main, the best, just want good government. And good government means taking some of the best things out of both parties.
Yeah. You famously draw a very firm line between personal life and politics. You make sure that they never, the political life never takes over and dominates. But so, what do you read when you're reading yourself? And what would you given all that we've talked about today, which books do you think you'd recommend people to have a read?
I don't know about the latter. What do I read? Don't read enough is the answer. I read, I quite like diaries, you'd be amazed to know, political diaries. I think it's a very good way of learning about things.
Gun to your head, best political diary, you think?
Well, I quite like, there's one which no one will, yes, they would have had done at the time. Graham Greene's diary is a very interesting diary about, what happened. You find out all kinds of things, that he was threatened being sued by J.B. Priestley for a character that he had invented, and he never met J.B. Priestley at this point. But the publishers were so dead scared that they took the book out, took the pages out, and then went ahead on that basis. So, I mean, you find things there which are absolutely fascinating, and I think a good diary I enjoy politically. I mean, I'm afraid my other reading is totally contrasted, and that is I quite like political thrillers, I have to tell you, and almost anything of that kind.
Best political thrillers? Well,
all the best thrillers, I think, are films like The Third Man, best film ever made, as far as I'm concerned. It's films like that which I enjoy, and books like that I enjoy.
Yeah. And you can't walk through this building occasionally without thinking about Francis Urquhart and To Play the King and all that kind of stuff. Isn't it funny? It's our day job, and yet when somebody writes about it in that kind of way, we can't resist it. We've got to be there, don't we? Mine's always All the President's Men. Oh, always rewatching All the President's Men.
Yes, that's a fantastic,
Yeah.
fantastic film and a
Love-
fantastic
Love it.
play. Yeah.
Norman, it has been an absolute pleasure for me. Thank you so much. For
Well,
your
I hope you made some sense out of what I've been saying.
Oh, I'm sure we have. You have, yeah. And I direct people to the box. They will not be disappointed. It's a good read. Thank you.
Thank you very much.